My dad remarried when I was 17, after my mom passed away a few years earlier. I never fully embraced my stepmom, but I tried to get along because I wanted my dad to be happy. During that time, I met my new stepsister, Nadine, who was a few years younger than me. She was quiet and we never really formed a sisterly bond, but we respected each other's space. My dad had always treated me like an adult, especially after mom died, so I assumed he'd also treat me fairly when it came to finances and big life decisions. Right after I turned 21, I received a small inheritance from my maternal grandparents. It wasn't massive, but it was a decent sum, enough that I felt secure about my future. My dad knew about this money. We talked about it, and he always said I should save it for something important. Maybe a down payment on a house or furthering my own education. I took him at his word, but then, a year later, Nadine graduated high school and decided she wanted to attend a private college. My dad came to me with a plan. If I loaned him the money to cover Nadine's tuition, he'd repay me within 5 years. He said he and my stepmom didn't have the funds right then, but as soon as their finances stabilized, they'd return every cent. He reassured me that this was a guaranteed arrangement I wouldn't regret. I was hesitant, but I'd always been raised to trust my dad. He told me how important it was for Nadine to get the right education, and I felt guilty if I didn't help. He also dangled the idea that he'd pay me back with interest as a gesture of gratitude. Looking back, I should have demanded a formal contract, but we settled for some scribbled notes on a piece of paper. My dad said family didn't need more than that. I believed him, so I wrote a check and handed over a significant chunk of my inheritance. In the back of my mind, I figured I'd have it back long before I needed it. My dad seemed grateful, and Nadine was thankful in her timid way. She and I hardly spoke about it. I assumed everything would work out in the end. Time passed quickly. I moved out, got my own place, and found a steady job. Nadine stayed in her dorm, rarely came home, and I rarely heard updates about her college life. Occasionally, my dad would mention that things were tight financially, but he never forgot his promise. At first, I was patient. I wasn't in a rush to buy a house, so I figured I could wait until the 5-year mark he'd set. For a while, I trusted that he would make good on his word because he was still my dad, and I believed in him. But as the years rolled on, I noticed he never once brought up how he planned to gather the repayment. Instead, he'd go on about how proud he was of Nadine's accomplishments and how her future looked bright. Whenever I hinted that I'd appreciate some kind of repayment schedule, he'd brush it off and say he needed just a bit more time. "Don't worry," he'd say, "I won't let you down." I wanted to believe him, so I kept quiet. Then I met Jason, who would eventually become my fiancé. We clicked immediately, shared values, and had plans for our future together. He wasn't from the same social circles as my dad and stepmom, but he treated me better than anyone I'd dated before. He was real and honest and worked hard for what he had. When we got engaged 2 years ago, I started thinking seriously about using my inheritance, once it was repaid, for the wedding expenses and possibly a house down payment. By that point, about 6 years had passed since I'd written that check for Nadine's tuition. My dad had never paid me back a single dollar. My patience was wearing thin. I approached him gently at first, explaining that it was time for him to start repaying me because Jason and I needed money for our wedding budget. My dad just stared at me with a heavy expression, like I'd asked for something unreasonable. He said, "I'm sorry, but I can't support that wedding. I don't approve of you marrying someone who doesn't respect our family's values. If you're going to go through with it, don't expect me to bankroll it." I reminded him that this wasn't about him paying for the wedding. This was about him returning the money I'd loaned him years ago, the money that was rightfully mine. He waved me off, said, "You should have known better than to give me that money if you needed it for something so trivial." I was stunned. Trivial? My own wedding was trivial? He wouldn't meet my eyes, and I felt my heart drop to the floor. This was the first time I realized my dad might never give me back a cent. It wasn't just about disapproving of Jason, it was about control. He liked that I relied on him emotionally, and he wasn't above using my own money as leverage. I was angry, but I still held onto a glimmer of hope. Maybe if I talked to him rationally and explained how much I needed this money, he'd come around. I tried again, sending emails outlining how we could set up a payment plan. I even offered to extend the time frame or reduce any interest he might have owed me. He never responded. My stepmom acted like it wasn't her business, even though I knew she had benefited from my loan too. Nadine graduated and went on to grad school, presumably on scholarships or loans. Nobody ever shared the details. She barely spoke to me unless it was a polite greeting at a holiday gathering. It was clear that everyone in that house had moved on, and my dad had no intention of revisiting his promise. I felt like a fool for trusting him in the first place. He was my father, and he betrayed me. I reached a breaking point when Jason and I started booking venues and making deposits for our wedding. We had a modest budget, but we were determined to pay for most of it ourselves. However, the money I'd lost to my dad would have been a huge help. My frustration boiled over one night, and I told Jason everything about the loan, the broken promises, and my dad's refusal to repay me. Jason was furious on my behalf, but he also supported my decision to pursue legal avenues if necessary. I decided to collect any evidence I had, old emails, the scribbled note my dad signed, and anything that might prove that money was a loan, not a gift. I asked a lawyer friend for advice, and he said I had a decent case for small claims court. I wrestled with the idea. Suing my own dad felt extreme, but he'd left me no choice. He was acting like my money was just his to keep. At that point, my resentment overshadowed any guilt I might have felt. If he was going to be stubborn, then I'd fight back. Jason stood by me, and I felt a renewed sense of determination. It wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was about justice, about not letting him walk all over me simply because he was my father. Before filing anything, I decided to confront him one last time. I showed up at his house unannounced. My stepmom was out, and Nadine was away. It was just the two of us. I laid out all the documents, explained that I was serious, and I needed the money back. I might have gotten emotional. I remember my voice shaking as I told him how hurt I was, how this wasn't fair, how he'd promised me something that I desperately needed now. He stayed quiet for a while, then he looked me in the eyes and said, "You've changed. You're letting that man manipulate you. This isn't who I raised you to be." I lost it. I yelled, told him how dare he accuse Jason of manipulation when he was the one who took advantage of his own daughter. I demanded he repay me within 30 days, or I'd see him in court. He scoffed, told me I wouldn't dare, and said I was ungrateful for everything he'd done. In that moment, I felt all the illusions of fatherly love shatter. He wasn't going to budge. As I walked out of that house, I realized I was finally severing the emotional ties that had kept me from fighting back. He'd taken my trust for granted one too many times. I filed the claim in small claims court. My lawyer friend helped me draft the paperwork. I had the original note, which clearly stated that the money was a loan for Nadine's tuition and that my dad would pay me back by a certain date. The date had passed over a year ago. I also had bank statements showing the withdrawal from my account and the deposit into his. The entire process felt surreal. Part of me kept expecting him to call and say, "We can work something out," but he never did. Instead, he avoided me entirely. My stepmom sent me a single text, "You're tearing this family apart." I didn't respond. Nadine didn't contact me at all. It took a couple of months for the court date to arrive. During that time, my wedding planning continued. Jason and I opted for something smaller to cut costs. My dad certainly wasn't contributing, so we had to be extra mindful of our budget. I tried not to let the legal drama overshadow the joy of planning my wedding, but every time I sat down to finalize the guest list, I felt a pang in my chest. I didn't want him there, not anymore. He'd made it clear that he didn't respect my fiancé or my choices. There was no way I was going to keep a seat open for someone who actively withheld my money and called my marriage trivial. That's when I removed him from the invitations altogether. It felt like a painful but necessary step. The day in court was nerve-wracking. My dad arrived looking sullen and irritated. He had a lawyer with him, someone I recognized as a local acquaintance of his, probably working at a reduced rate. I had my friend who guided me through the proceedings. The judge listened patiently as I explained the situation, handed over evidence, and detailed how the agreement came about. My dad's lawyer tried to claim that the money was a gift, but our scribbled note proved otherwise. His lawyer also tried to argue that the statute of limitations might apply, but we'd made the agreement less than 10 years ago, and I had continuous emails reminding him of the debt. The judge seemed unimpressed with my dad's excuses. When it was his turn to speak, he rambled on about how I was marrying someone he didn't approve of and that he shouldn't be forced to pay for something that went against his beliefs. The judge cut him off, reminding him that the case was about a loan, not about whether or not he liked my fiancé. In the end, I won. The court ordered my dad to pay me back the principal amount plus a small amount of interest. He was given a strict deadline. I remember feeling a surge of relief. Justice was served, but the heartbreak of knowing my dad would stoop so low was still there. Regardless, I was satisfied. He wouldn't get away with it. I thought that would be the end, but my dad decided to make it ugly. He refused to pay by the court-ordered date. When I tried to enforce the judgment, he made it a point to transfer all his assets under my stepmom's name, which complicated everything. I got letters from his lawyer claiming that he had no liquid funds, no property in his name, and no way to pay me. It was a blatant attempt to dodge the ruling. My lawyer friend explained that there were ways to challenge this, but it would take time and money. I was caught between wanting to move forward with my life and wanting to hold my dad accountable. The idea that he'd go to such lengths to avoid paying me back was infuriating. That's when I decided to take a different route. I knew how important his reputation was to him. He ran a small local business, prided himself on being a pillar of the community, and he'd always bragged about his integrity. I gathered every piece of evidence I had, our loan agreement, the court ruling, the communications from his lawyer, and wrote a factual account of how he was refusing to pay a debt to his own daughter. I posted it online in local community groups with copies of the judgment attached. I didn't embellish or slander him, I just laid out the truth in plain text. If he wanted to hide behind legal loopholes, I would make sure everyone knew. The fallout was immediate. Clients started questioning his ethics. His business partners didn't like the negative publicity. He tried to contact me in a fury, leaving voicemails that alternated between threats and pleas. He said I was sabotaging his livelihood. I refused to pick up his calls. He'd already made it clear that he had no respect for me. Now he wanted me to take down the truth to protect his precious image. I stood my ground. I told him that once he paid me what the court said he owed, I'd gladly post an update saying the matter was resolved. Until then, the information would remain up. My stepmom showed up at my apartment crying, saying I was ruining their lives. I told her that I'd given them every chance to repay me, and they chose to ignore the ruling. If they wanted to keep everything quiet, they should have paid their debts. She stormed off, muttering curses. In the end, my dad buckled. He found a way to free up the funds, and the money appeared in my bank account shortly before my wedding. There was no apology attached. He didn't show up at the ceremony, he wasn't welcome, and even if he had been, I doubt he would have come. My stepmom and Nadine didn't attend either. Jason and I had a beautiful wedding regardless. We were surrounded by people who genuinely cared about us. I used part of the money to cover some last-minute wedding bills, and we put the rest into a savings account for our future. I wish I could say that I forgave my dad, but I haven't. I can't. He betrayed me, tried to manipulate me, and attempted to evade a legal judgment. He forced me to drag everything into the public sphere just to get what was rightfully mine. I'm moving on, but I'll never forget or forgive. Some people say revenge leaves you hollow, but in my case, it gave me closure. He wanted to play dirty, and I gave him a taste of his own medicine. Now, Jason and I are focusing on building a life together without my dad's toxic influence. I have no regrets. If he wanted to stay in my life, he should have honored his promise. That's the story of how my father tried to cheat me and how I made him pay for it, literally.